Hello and welcome to the Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track program in which we take a holistic look at one issue or a person or a chapter of India's current narrative or from the past. We are today going to be talking about Nehru. You will ask possibly or wonder as to why Nehru now? Is there an anniversary coming up? But then the question is that why not Nehru now? Why not Nehru at any point of time? After all, you need not require anniversaries to discuss iconic nation makers of the country. So, we will be talking about Jawaharlal Nehru because over the last 10 plus years, since 2014 May, the BJP, right from that time specifically, also a bit earlier, has essentially mastered the art of appropriating various nationalist leaders. All kinds of people are now part of the pantheon, right from Mahatma Gandhi, used more as a sanitary inspector and a pair of spectacles, as somebody said. But nonetheless, Gandhi is part of the BJP's pantheon. So is Sardar Patel. So is Lal Bahadur Shastri. So is so and so, and we can go on indefinitely, except Jawaharlal Nehru. The Indian Council of Historical Research recently prepared a list of people who have been very pioneering, who contributed greatly to the building of the Indian nation. Nehru's name is missing. So, who do we turn to if we want to talk about Nehru and then juxtapose it, more importantly, with the Nehruvian vision and with the vision of today's politics, the icons of today? We are turning to Professor Aditya Mukherjee, who was at the Jawaharlal Nehru University for several decades. He very recently, a few months ago, wrote a very important book which has been very widely critically appreciated by people. Nehru's India, Past, Present, and the Future. I need not tell you, possibly a large number of viewers would have known that he was one of the co-authors of the most important, historical history books of modern India from the 1980s onwards. India's struggle for independence, and then it was followed up by the continuing part of it, that India since independence. So, welcome to the program, and thank you, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, for sparing time in between of addressing various seminars and discussing Nehru and your book, but also finding time for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for calling me.
Professor Mukherjee, the first thing which we learned about Nehru, if I go back to my past, to the school days, various things, that he was the first Prime Minister of India. Besides that, one always associated him with the book called Discovery of India. It's only much later on that I learned that Nehru, besides being all that was being constantly talked about, he was also a fairly significant historian of India right from the ancient period till now. The Hindu nationalistic or the Hindu, not nationalistic, I know that you disagree with this phrase, but it's just become so much a part of it. Let's rather call it Hindu majoritarian politics. Also is built on their presentation of history. And if we talk about the exclusivist interpretation of history, the biggest name which comes to mind is V.D. Savarkar, whose entire writings was essentially based on his understanding of history. So let us understand from you a very basic fact that the divergence, first Nehru, how he understood as India's history, what it was, and how it was divergent, how it was different from that of Savarkar, and through that, the Hindu majoritarian forces.
Thank you, Nilanjan. when I was writing this book, Nehru's
mm,
India, one of the things which struck me most was, and there is a whole section in it called Nehru and the Discipline of History. What struck
right.
me is how advanced he was in writing in the 1940s
Mm,
in describing what the discipline of history, how it should be, what are the various pitfalls, and so on and so forth. But I'll take up, coming from your question, just one aspect of history that he talks about.
mm,
Right after independence in December 1948, he was addressing a group of historians, and he says the following. He says, and now this is just immediately after the partition, when the country
mm.
has just broken up hmm, into two pieces,
Yes.
and it's a time when the communal temperature is at its peak. So he says that uh, history shows us both the binding process and the disruptive process. Hmm? Binding
Mhm,
or the constructive forces, or the disruptive or the physiporous forces. And he says, you
mm,
as a historian, hmm, you have a choice of what you want to look at, what you want to emphasize. And he
mm,
says that I think that you should be emphasizing on the constructive forces and the binding forces. And for that, you don't have to cook up any history. He says there is
mm,
enough in our history for you to draw from that. And his discovery of India is the most brilliant example, an
mm,
example which has been now followed by the whole world over. Every scientist historian uses that model to look back at our history and draw what is the best from it. To give you just
mm,
one example, he draws from the Indus Valley civilization, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Buddha, Akbar. He draws from all of them a dialogical tradition that existed in India from the very
mhm,
ancient past. The notion of multiple truths, the ability to live with difference, and this kind
mm,
of thing. And he demonstrates it repeatedly. Beginning, as I said, from the original hymn of the Rig Veda, how in
mm,
that there is an argument for God, saying that maybe this is the creator, and simultaneously says maybe there isn't. So there is
mm.
monism in it, and there is atheism right from the start. And he so shows this
Right.
throughout. And uh, the contrast to that is those who uh, try to create a memory, sometimes draw from
Mm,
actual historical fact that there has to be in every historical situation some conflict. Now, do you just draw on that out of context, or do you, as these guys do, Hindu communalists do? In fact, the British started the whole strategy of creating a false memory of a divergence between the people. And I've in the
mm,
book given the most glaring example of this, because we all as children grew up about the attack on the Somnath temple by the Muhammad
mm.
of Ghazni in the 11th
That's right.
century. Right? And in the it was in the 19th century, for the first time, that the issue of this destruction of the temple was brought up, and it was said that the Hindu psyche was seared by this, and the Hindus and the Muslims were separated, became completely two divergent forces since then. And this was said for the
Right.
first time in the British Parliament in the 19th century. In
Mm.
1951, K.M. Munshi repeats this, that the attack on Somnath seared the
Yes, that it was
psyche.
an attack on Indian Hindu civilization.
That's right. The scholar like Professor Romila Thapar said, "Why don't I examine this? That what is
Mm,
it that actually happened?" And she used multiple sources, Persian, Sanskrit, etc., and came to the following conclusion. She wrote a whole book on it, on Somnath, where she shows that after the destruction, within 100 years, the Somnath temple was rebuilt, and the person who rebuilt it
mm,
doesn't even mention Mahmud of Ghazni. Hmm? And
mm,
even more, after about 200 years, in the presence of the temple, a Muslim trader
mm,
was given permission to build a mosque. Again, there
mm,
is no question of the Hindu psyche and the Muslim psyche have been divided. You see, as she points out, that the first time it is said is 800 years later by the British. It is the
mm,
British writers of the 19th century who began to talk of Muslim tyranny, from which the
Hmm.
British have saved the Hindus. You see, this was the paradigm they built. And the communalists just picked it
Okay.
up. Hindu communalists just picked it up. They didn't invent an alternate model. They just borrowed the colonial model and are building on it in the name of nationalism. So this is just one
Hmm.
example of what you can do with history, and we know that the price of uh, creating memories of this kind, which are disruptive, can be very, very
Hmm.
heavy. A similar thing happened in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, in a
Hmm.
14th century battle, in which
Hmm.
the Muslims were supposed to have killed many Christians, was worked up in a big way and a huge memory created. And in the 1990s, you know, you had this massacre in Srebrenica, where there's still the graves of thousands of Muslims, as a mausoleum in Bosnia to show what can happen. And the result of this kind of imaginary identities and building up differences on that basis was that Yugoslavia broke up into 6 countries. My fear is that if we misuse our history the way we are doing, finding
Hmm.
a a temple under every mosque and wanting to take revenge on that basis, true or false, you know, even for
Actually,
the Supreme Court has said
I,
that there is, you know,
I will just interrupt here and just remind you that it's not just trying to find a temple beneath every mosque. What has been said, that for the last at least 25 years, the important political leaders of the BJP, most importantly, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as part of the political rhetoric, they have been referring to the medieval era right from sometime around the 9th or the 10th century AD till the advent of the British as the era of slavery. Now, till the time it was being said in various electoral speeches in elections campaign, it was still understanding as political rhetoric that politicians keep on doing. But even after becoming the prime minister, and as late as 2023, when he went to the United States, he went and actually the U.S. House, U.S. Congress, to the
right.
joint, the two houses were sitting, and he actually spoke about the Indian history and 1200 years of slavery. So, which is
Absolutely.
actually straight away, would you say that this view of history, it straight away evolves from the Savarkarite understanding of Indian history, and which is completely juxtaposed to what Nehru had seen through, the book that we were talking about, the discovery of India.
You see, this notion of 1,000 years, sometimes he says 1,000,
Thousand
sometimes he
and
says
1200. It's depending
because,
on the
for,
mood, what comes out. Because it's
if
not
you
the
are
truth. If the truth is, then you have to be consistent.
if you are trained in entire political science, what does 200 years mean? It doesn't make a
Mm.
difference, right? So you're absolutely right. In the US Congress, from the ramparts of the Red Fort, he's been talking of 100 years of foreign rule oppression. Hmm? The British ruled
Mm.
for less than 200 years. So the
Mm.
target, you see, these are dog whistles. The target are the Muslims. And
Mm.
again, Nehru writes beautifully about it. He says how empires of the ancient and medieval past mustn't be confused with colonial empires. Colonial empires are a
Mm.
completely different ball game. The Mauryan Empire, the Mughal Empire, and the Roman Empire are not the same as the British Empire. You know, so and this notion of Muslims being foreigners. Muslims came to
Mm.
India while the Prophet was still alive. So
That's
it
right.
is they are creating. This is why I'm saying that this is a misuse of history. You know, to din it into your minds that for 1,000 years you've been oppressed. They've been saying it repeatedly, even with the consecration of the Ram temple. He said 500 years of struggle to build the temple.
Mm.
The Mon
That
Bhagwat
that
in
wasn't the
last
case.
precisely not. What? That's 500 years. The whole controversy started only in the mid 19th century
That's right.
when
1850s is the
when
time when
right,
controversy actually started.
Hanuman Gadi priest
Mm.
uh, was accused that by some Muslims that they had that temple was built on a mosque, you see, and his
Mm.
his strategy was to make a counter claim. And he then goes on, occupies what was called the Chabutra, Ram Chabutra, outside the
That's
mosque,
right.
and said ki Ram was born here, right? So
Hmm.
this attempt was again converted by the British in the 1870s to say that there is a belief that Ram was born here. You see,
That's
and
right.
now they are calling it, a belief by somebody who just claims that. And now they are saying that no, Ram was born there, and
Well,
for a
now,
hundreds of years,
unfortunately, the Ramayana is no longer mythology of Hinduism, but it has actually become the history of India. That is how it is presented, and that is
and it is
how it is
absurd.
talked about.
When
Correct.
Ramayana was written, uh, the Balmiki Ramayana, the original Ramayana,
That's
it
right.
was written
Yeah.
as kavya. It was an epic.
Yeah.
It was neither
It was
itihas,
an epic.
nor was it religion. You know, the religious aspect also is inserted much later. And Ayodhya, what is now called Ayodhya was used to be called Saket. So nobody even knows
That's
where
right. It was
Ayodhya.
a Buddhist city. It used to be called. Uh, Professor Mukherjee, moving on, Nehru, after independence, insisted on India being governed by, according to three principles, which I want to understand from you: democracy, sovereignty, and secularism. One may also add his commitment to federalism also. I would like to hear from you as to how Nehru and why was he so committed to democracy, to sovereignty, to secularism, and even federalism?
And I would add the scientific temper. Because
Yeah,
this was
scientific
not
temper
Nehru.
I was intending to speak about later on because I wanted
Right,
to
right, right,
juxtapose it to the unscientific temper which we have very recently seen right through the entire COVID period. We will talk about it separately
right,
because it's a very important aspect of Nehru which is not touched about much.
correct. The
Democracy,
reason,
sovereignty,
the reason why
secularism.
Nehru focuses on democracy, secularism, sovereignty, federalism is not because this was Nehru's ideas, because this is what
Hmm.
were the core values of the national movement, which Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And the reason why Gandhiji chose Nehru as his successor, because he was the most capable person in not only fighting for this, he fought, after all, the British for 30 years, nine of those
Hmm.
years in jail, hmm, but the
Right.
most capable implementing those ideas in the newborn state. And that is the question you are asking, that why does he do it? I'm saying this is the reason why he does it. And the fascinating part is, after all, the Mahatma is murdered within 6 months of independence, and Patel dies in 1950. So virtually the entire burden, or a very large part of the burden of implementing this idea of India, falls on Jawaharlal Nehru. And he
Hmm.
does a Herculean task of implementing these ideas in a situation which people forget. The critics of Nehru, like these Panagarayas and all, they forget what were the initial conditions from which Nehru starts. What is it that India inherits at independence? Again, the poet Rabindranath Tagore put it probably best. He said that the British will have to leave India one day, but when they do leave India, what mud and filth will they leave behind? So the mud and filth that was left behind, your average life expectancy was less than 30 years. Can you believe it?
That's
Average.
that's true.
Which the poor must have died, God knows, in their infancy. Hmm. The 94% of women were illiterate, 84% of the population was illiterate. The uh, the country was famine ridden. 4 years before independence, 3 million people die of famine. Hmm?
Right.
And most of all, the British left India as a deeply divided society, hmm, killing each other. 500,000 killed at independence, 6 million refugees. It is from this
Yes.
situation that he has to build a modern India with secularism and with democracy. A Herculean task. And as I said, that he did an absolutely brilliant job of it.
Let's try to understand. You have actually taken a very important point. That bitterly divided India, yet managed to be on the secular path. Of course, there was tremendous animosity in the majority community against the minorities, especially the Muslims. How did Nehru go about knitting this process and putting, to use it figuratively, putting balm on the terribly lacerated body of India? How did he do it?
Very, very good question. Again, I would say it is not only Nehru, it was
Hmm.
the legacy of the national movement, and it was the Mahatma and Nehru as his probably most able disciple, that was
Right.
able to handle this situation. And the fact that it fell on Nehru's shoulders to prevent this situation from increasing is why the BJP, your first question, original one, why it is him that they target. And I'll just
Hmm.
describe why. You correctly said
Yes.
that what we inherit is what I have called in the book a Holocaust-like situation. Something like what it was in Europe under Nazi rule.
Post.
500,000 is not a small thing, 6 million
Hmm.
refugees, right? And on top of that, the Mahatma is murdered. And
Right.
Nehru says very clearly that this was not the act of one madman. It was an organization which was trying to do many more murders like this and create an unstable situation where they could do, it is his words, they could do a coup and change the nature
Hmm.
of the state. That is, build a Hindu Rashtra, use this
Hmm.
aggravated communal situation to create a Hindu Rashtra. And what Gandhiji and Nehru did was to prevent that. Gandhiji,
Hmm.
as you know, in 1946 onwards, when the biggest event of the 20th century is happening, the transfer of power, from Britain to India, which broke the whole colonial empires the world over. At that time, the leader of the movement is not available. He was in Noakhali, a remote district in Bangladesh, today's Bangladesh,
Right.
walking the streets.
Hmm.
And when the leader said, Mahatma Ji, when will you come back? How long will you be there? He said, as long as it takes. And he remained there for 4 months. From November
Right.
46 till February 47, he was walking the streets of Noakhali on the assumption that what use is this India if the soul of India is destroyed? So independence meant nothing to him if the soul was taken out, which was Hindu-Muslim unity for Mahatma.
Yes, he was a
And then
bitterly, upset
he
person, on the 15th of August,
absolutely
1947.
his last, in fact, his last fast before he was assassinated was to bring back every Muslim who had been thrown out of their house in Delhi to their homes and repair their mosques. Otherwise, he said, I'll
Right.
die. And
That's
such
right.
was the pressure that even the RSS had to say, okay, we will pull
Yes,
back
that
because
joint
that is right.
statement which he forced everybody
That
to
is
put
right.
their names on.
That is right. And then he was murdered. And then it fell on
Yes.
Nehru to prevent this coup. And what he did from Gandhiji's assassination for the next 2-3 years is absolutely amazing. Apart from putting the RSS in jail, banning the organization, etc., he converted the first general election, I believe the most
Hmm.
important election in our history, post-independence history, into a referendum. That do the people of India want the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan? Do we want a Hindu Rashtra, which will be like Muslim Pakistan, or do we want a secular India? And he campaigned relentlessly throughout the country.
This question, was it part of his principal electoral thrust, his campaign?
I believe so. I believe that this was one of the primary things he was arguing. And the result
Okay.
was that 94% of the Indian people voted for a secular India. Ram Rajya Parishad, Hindu Mahasabha, and
And the
Jansangh, which is
Jansar.
predecessor of the BJP, put together got only 6% of the votes, only 10 seats out of 487, despite this communal atmosphere. So they were pushed back by decades. But Nehru had a very important thing to tell us at that time, the lessons of that election. He said the primary lesson of this election is that you can win against communalism if you fight it directly, if you don't compromise
Hmm.
it with it. If you compromise with communalism, you lose. If you fight it directly, you win, number one. Number two, he said, winning the election is very good, but it is not enough. You have to continue
That's
to
right.
do ideological battle and use state power to keep these fascist forces in check. We did neither. Hmm. We began to
Hmm.
compromise with communalism from the 1960s onwards in the states, and in 1977 at a national level. The Janata Party, allowed the RSS and the Jansangh to merge with it. So for the first time,
That's
the
right.
untouchables in Indian politics came into high politics at the center. And we
Became
did it again.
ministers.
Yeah. Again in
two
1989,
very
we did.
important, two very important portfolios: external affairs and information and broadcasting.
You're absolutely right. Again in 1989, we did it. That Congress is more dangerous than the BJP. And several parties, including the left, all secular parties, joined hands
That's right.
with the BJP. And BJP moved from 2 to 80, and the rest is history. So Nehru's lesson was not learned, and we are paying a heavy price for it today.
Let us move to another issue, which I know is one of your primary areas of interest, that is economic history. It is said that Nehru had a vision of the economic vision that of growth of India was that it is not completely privatized. There was a heavy state component in it. What we also very loosely have been saying as mixed economy. But you know, it can possibly be said that the path that Nehru chose, did he somehow prevent by ensuring that taking care of the poor of India and also ensuring that India did not become, like you said in one of your speeches, as a banana republic. I'd like to
Right.
understand the economic model which he chose for India, why, and how it really benefited India and the people.
See,
Yes.
again, it was not an economic model that he chose alone. Hmm? This notion of a big public sector at independence was already there in what was famously called the Bombay Plan, which was written
That's
by
right.
all the capitalists. Tata, Birla, Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, Mafatlal, just name it. Every major Singhanias, everybody was signatories to it. They all wanted a big public sector, because the alternative to that would have been foreign investment. And Indian capital also didn't want to be dominated by that. So, firstly, to put it all on
Hmm.
Nehru's head is absurd. That is not what it is.
Okay.
But what is true is that Nehru's strategy of development in the early years is now being criticized by neoliberal, neo-colonial scholars, people like Tirthankar Roy and Meghnad Desai. And now the
Hmm.
bandwagon has been joined by Panagria. He's just written another
Hmm.
book. How, basically they are saying that the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted years. If only we had
Hmm.
done what we have done after 1991, where would we have gone? Only
Hmm.
an economist can talk such rubbish. If
Hmm.
anybody without any sense of history, any sense of
True.
timing, any sense of context, in the 1950s, as you quoted me, I have argued in the book, in the 1950s, if you did what you did in 1991, we would have been a banana republic. Hmm? Similarly, in the 1990s, to push the 1950s strategy would be absurd. The
Right.
1990s opening was possible because what Nehru did in the 1950s and
In the
60s.
1950s onwards.
That's right. Every major economist of that period in the world, W. Rostov, Ian Little, Brian Redaway, just name anybody. All of them said what
Hmm.
Nehru was doing was an amazing effort. In fact, as Sukumai Chakravarti wrote in one of his books, that development economics and India's development were sort of coterminous. One was creating the other. The Chinese model was looked upon as the totalitarian model, and certainly not more successful. China was not growing any faster than India in the Nehruvian period. So it
Hmm.
was an amazing model where we were able to make a transition from a pre-industrial society virtually into industrialism and modernity with democracy and sovereignty. Unparalleled effort in world history. Nehru himself said that I have no guidance from history. No country in the world industrialized with democracy. Slavery, enclosure movements, colonial appropriation. Every country which industrialized had a colony, and so on and so forth. Or they did it on the backs of their working class and peasantry. India did not. So it kept its democracy intact.
Hmm.
Neither did we follow the East Asian model of becoming a junior partner to one or the other superpowers and use that route to have quick development. Hmm? So this
Okay.
was, as I said, a great achievement. So when we see people uh, demonizing or undermining this great achievement, and in fact moving in the opposite direction, it is a great tragedy indeed.
Right. When we talk about, you said that people say that why did not Nehru choose the path which we actually chose in 1991? Uh, to what extent did the economic model which Nehru chose, did it benefit the large sections of the poor Indian population, or the poorer sections of Indian population? That's a better
Uh,
way of phrasing it.
the answer to that, to begin with, is to nail another lie, which is that
Hmm.
Nehru ignored agriculture. Hmm. The
Hmm.
man who does the land reforms in India, hmm,
Hmm.
changes a nearly 200-year-old land system of zamindari and jagirdari within 7 years
Yes.
after independence, is ridiculous. And that too with democracy, with no General MacArthur's army sitting on your head, or no killing off of millions of kulaks, right? With democracy, to
Right.
do this land reform was an amazing task. I mean, the impact it had on the poor is, you know, unbelievably big. In fact, Daniel Thorner, perhaps the best known uh, agrarian economist of that period, even now, had written that it is often said that the first three plans ignored agriculture. First three plans are the Nehruvian period, right?
Hmm.
Ignored agriculture. He says this view cannot be sustained. More change, he says, occurred in this period, in this 15 years, than happened in the previous 200 years. I mean, he's saying that this is a revolutionary period in agrarian change. So it is again, as I said, the spreading of propaganda. Nehru ignored primary
Okay.
education. Nehru ignored this. Nehru ignored light industry. He built heavy industry because without that you had no independence. Nehru said at
Hmm.
independence we were a neo-colonial country. We had political independence, but we were economically dependent and dependent on technology for the same countries from which we got independence. What kind of independence is
Hmm.
this? In economics or in political economy, it is called indeed neo-colonialism. So he evolved a strategy with Mahalanobis called the Nehru Mahalanobis strategy, which was indeed
Mhm.
goods based, which transformed the Indian landscape. I'll give you just one statistic. It is so powerful. At
Mhm.
independence, to invest in anything, and you cannot grow without investing, you would, to start a factory, let's say, you'll need machinery. We produced no
That's right.
machinery.
Hmm.
95% of our machine tools, pliers, ranges had to be imported. Hmm.
Imported.
So we were totally dependent from 1945 onward. There were industrial delegations going out of India all over the world saying, please give us machines. Where can we buy machines, right? So that situation changes under Nehru's strategy of development. By
Right.
1960, we had to import only 43%, and by 1970s, only 9%. That is 91% of our development we could do on our own basis. That is the basis of our independent economic foreign policy. That is what gave you true sovereignty.
Right.
So, it is a balance. Why did he do this? Because sovereignty was the goal of India's independence struggle. You had to become sovereign, not
That's
only
right. You
notionally,
had
but
to
and you
in
had to
actual
have this
practice.
strategy. But he did it not by abandoning the poor, as is happening today. You know, I mean, the
Right.
inequity, the obscene inequity that you see today was unheard of in Nehruvian times.
Right. Let me ask you a question. You have talked about the decision of the impact of this regime's policies. One of the first decisions after becoming the prime minister in 2014, this government, which was formed by Mr. Modi, one of the first decisions was to wind up the planning commission
Yes.
and called something for a long time. It did not even have a name.
Yeah.
Eventually, this nameless wonder was called the Niti Ayog, some kind of an abbreviation full form, which I think about 90% of the Indians, or maybe even more, would have forgotten. If you have a random survey going around, a vox pop with a mic moving, and that what is the full form of Niti Ayog, I'm not sure that how many people would be able to say that. Now, as somebody who had been very deeply studying, the economic sovereignty which Nehru brought about and the various structures, how did you feel when the planning commission was wound up? What were
It,
your
it, it, I mean, it was a direct attack on federalism. One of
mm,
the acts of the Planning Commission was to ensure that development was not disjointed, that it was some regions were not left behind. A Planning Commission had to do it. You cannot leave
right.
everything to the market forces. How were resources to be distributed? How were it to in a manner that all parts of the country had more or less a balanced level of growth? This was one of the activities of the Planning Commission. Also, the Planning
Mm,
Commission would look at the distributive aspect of development.
mm,
Hmm? That are we just measuring growth rates, or are we also looking at the Human Development Index? Now, all
mm,
these
mm.
questions were abolished with the abolition of the Planning Commission. You see, and also it was done partly. Our current Prime Minister obviously wants to replace Modi at Nehru at all levels.
Nehru.
Whatever he has done has to be undone. Even the Nehru jacket has to become a Modi jacket. So you know this desire to obliterate him from history, as you correctly said. They are celebrating the 75th year of India's independence, and when the ICHR makes a poster, they forget to put
Mm.
Nehru on that poster and they put Savarkar, a person who actually apologized and collaborated with the
And
British
who
right
actually
till.
said that this independence is not real independence? It is a false independence.
That's right. That's right. He, Kangana Raut, and our uh, this Mohan Bhagwat are on the same page on this. They all say, कोई कहता है 2014 में आजादी आई. That is Kangana Raut says we got our independence in 2014 with Modi. Hmm? What we got in
That's right.
1947, she says, was weak. So with one sweep, from Bhagat Singh to Mahatma Gandhi to Naroji to Patel, Nehru, sab bhikari ban gaye. And then
Mm.
uh, our Mohan Bhagwat goes one step forward and said the real Azadi came only with the consecration of the Ram Temple in
Ram
1924.
Temple,
In 2024, you know.
2024.
So there, I mean, this is history being really rewritten in a bizarre manner.
You mentioned about scientific temper. Now, that was actually one of the very principal beliefs of Nehru, that we must have a scientific and modern, outlook. How would you define the scientific temper, the idea of scientific temper that Nehru believed in? What was it? I know there was
You
a big
see,
revival by the Nehru Center in the 1980s, and then we all tried to reintroduce the idea of scientific temper in the Indian discourse.
yeah, it's very important to emphasize this aspect of Nehru, his promoting
Hmm.
of the scientific temper, because people recognize that he created almost every scientific institution that we know of.
That's right.
IIT, IIM, AIMS, BARC, National Physical Laboratory, National Chemical Laboratory, you know, ISRO, just name anything. All of them were created in the Nehruvian period, including the non-science institutions like Lalit Kala Academy and Sangeet Natak Academy, National Institute of
That's right.
Design, the Film Institute. All of them happened in Nehru's time, right? But the important thing is not to just produce engineers and doctors who would go abroad and then fund fascist forces in their home country.
Right.
They have obviously not got the scientific temper. So, and that is what Nehru is trying to say, that scientific temper is more than just becoming a scientist. Most scientists these days do not have a scientific temper. Hmm? I mean, they are
Hmm.
spreading the kind of obscurantist ideas which shocks even a
Well, the
primary school.
IIT director recently has been talking about all the virtues of Gomutra and the other
Precisely.
products, from the cow.
So, Nehru used this term scientific temper for the first time in the discovery of India. And
Hmm.
since you asked me the question, I'll just read out a couple of lines of how he defines the
Sure.
scientific temper. Hmm? Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
The scientific temper points at the way along which man should travel. It is the scientific approach, the adventurous and yet critical temper of science, the search for truth and new knowledge, the refusal to accept anything without testing and trial, the capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of evidence. This is very important. The reliance on the observed fact and not preconceived theory, the hard discipline of the mind. All this is necessary not merely for the application of science, but for life itself and the solution of its many problems. So this Nehru was very clear. And as I said, again, this was part of the national movement's objective. There was a consensus on this from the left to the right, from Dadabhai Naruji to Bhagat Singh. There was a consensus on all these ideas. So the secularism, democracy, scientific temper, sovereignty, there was no, that is why it is the idea of India.
Right.
And what have we done to it? You gave some examples, but it is in a country where your prime minister himself talks about plastic surgeries in the ancient times being done because of the snout of Ganesha, elephant
Ganesh.
snout had put on that, or even worse, the governor of Bengal had said engineering fair in Calcutta that
Hmm.
Arjun of Mahabharat had an arrow
Yes.
which was nuclear tipped. So a nuclear tipped arrow was there in Arjun's time, right? And he got
That
promoted for
period.
wisdom. He became the vice president of the country, right? So we are doing such utter injustice. And you correctly mentioned that the result of that is what happens during Corona. You bang thalis, you do tali, you show torches at Corona, you say Corona go, you do Ganga Snan, you have Gomutra. I mean, millions of people, lakhs of people died. So the price that people have to pay for such the promoting of such unscientific values. I in fact end my book by saying that Nehru, Gandhi, our nationalist leaders were really lifting the Indian people from the mud and filth that was left behind by the British. What our current leaders are doing is pushing us back into the same mud and filth of superstition, obscurantism, of unfreedom, of fear, and most importantly, of communal hatred. And that is what is the most dangerous part, that it is our leadership, rather than mitigating our differences, they are actually promoting those differences, and which can create a very, very dangerous situation for our country. Journalists like you have been pointing it out. Harish Khare recently wrote an article in which he asked the RSS that, do you realize what you are doing? You are pushing the country towards a civil war. That,
Hmm.
we are going to become something like what is going on in other parts of the world. Do we want a similar situation to the Gaza, to the situation? You're pushing us towards a civil war. And Gregory Stanton said,
Kind of social, the kind of social, unrest and conflict which we actually envisage coming up over the next 2 years is quite frightening at times. When we see the politics of excluding one very large community from Indian society and actually pushing them to a corner.
and
Moving
very
on from here,
is an understatement.
sorry?
It's 200. I said very large is an
Yes,
understatement.
it's an
200 million
understatement
people.
because
It's
yes, yes,
200 million people.
yes, you simply cannot, put them in a box and say that they are locked up. It cannot be an open jail. Like you could possibly the British could do it to one individual, Ratnagiri, Savarkar, and even then they failed to actually ensure that he, you know, took no part in politics. He continued to promote all kinds of politics. It's a different thing that it was not seen as politics by the colonial,
British succeeded in diverting Savarkar's politics to politics of loyalism, a politics which
yes,
suited them and which went against the national movement. There they were successful. But on the Civil War question, the person who predicted the Rwandan genocide, Gregory Stanton,
mm,
has recently gave a statement where he said that if you look at the indicators that are happening in India, you know,
mm,
and all of us have seen the open calls for genocide that have been given, with impunity. Nothing has happened to these people, right? And the way
right.
the minority is being continuously needled, he predicts that if this continues, if we are not able to stem it, then India is probably going to see one of the world's worst genocides. So it is not a joking matter. It is not just a matter of an
No, it
opinion.
is,
I think our society, our country is facing a very grave risk.
you know, It is actually a hope on which I would like to conclude this conversation. We can, of course, continue talking about Nehru and talk about various dimensions of his thinking and of the models which he introduced in India. We can also hope at on the point, that we do not, despite being pushed by the present regime, we do not move into kind of a civil war, which we talked about. And somewhere or the other, we keep on talking about the Nehruvian spirit and actually get inspired from it. We can expect possibly the people to get inspired and ensure that we don't go into the civil war. Professor Mukherjee, thank you very much for actually talking about a fairly dry subject, with a lot of passion and to be able to convince people that yes, Nehru is not something that has to be junked in our dustbins, but somebody whose ideas need to be understood once again, and also important for us to understand the relevance of Nehru and Nehruvian thought for the coming challenges ahead in India. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for bringing up the subject itself. Thank you.